"You must have gotten turned around, darling. The staff entrance is around the back." The voice cut across the ballroom like a bell, loud enough that half the room turned to look. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be," she said quietly. "Oh, sweetheart, no. The kitchen crew comes in through the side. Someone show her the way." A ripple of amused laughter moved through the officers gathered around him. "General, be nice. She's clearly confused." "Which contractor did they send you with, honey?" She held her glass of water and did not blink. "Marine Scout snipers, a long time ago." The laughter cracked open into something louder, something meaner. "You, a sniper, well then." He raised his crystal tumbler high above his head and clicked his heels together with theatrical precision. "A toast, gentlemen, to the Lady General in the gold dress. Tell us, ma'am, what was your rank?" Have you ever watched a decorated man laugh directly into the face of the one person on earth he should have been standing at attention for? Because in the next few minutes, you are going to watch that general realize exactly who the woman in the gold gown really is, and what the crossed rifles inked beneath her sleeve actually cost her to earn. Comment below where you're watching from tonight. Drop a like if stories about the underestimated hitting back with the truth are your favorite kind. And let us take you back to where this really begins. Because to understand why a Marine general's smile died mid-laugh in front of 400 witnesses, you have to leave that chandeliered ballroom in Washington. You have to drive 9 hours west, past the freeways and the fast food signs, past the last strip of highway with cell service, into a small mountain town in West Virginia where nobody has ever heard of a place called the Kandahar Corridor. There is a little diner on the main street of that town. It sells breakfast all day and pie by the slice, and it is owned and run by a black woman in her mid-40s named Marion Ellsbury. The regulars will tell you she is the calmest person they have ever met in their lives. She refills coffee without being asked. She remembers everyone's grandkids' names. When Mrs. Petrova's husband died last February, Marion closed the diner for the afternoon and drove out to her farmhouse with a pot of stew, and she stayed until the sister from Ohio arrived at midnight, and she never once mentioned it again. That is who the town believes she is. A quiet woman who is good with her hands and better with her heart. She wears long sleeves in every season of the year. If you ask her why, she gives you a soft smile and says her arms get cold easy, and she pivots the conversation so gently that you never quite realize she did. Nobody in that town knows what those sleeves are hiding. Nobody knows that the woman pouring your coffee once did something on a hillside in a country most Americans cannot find on a map that grown Marines still whisper about at reunions when the lights go down and the second bottle comes out. She likes it exactly that way. She built this entire small life around being unremarkable, because being remarkable had already cost her the one person in the world she could not survive losing twice. Every morning before she unlocks the diner's front door, Marion Ellsbury does one thing. She reaches under the collar of her shirt and closes her fingers around a single worn dog tag that hangs on a thin chain against her sternum. The name stamped into the metal is not hers. It belonged to a big goofy kid from Baton Rouge named Isaiah Monroe, the man everyone called Preacher, because he could quote scripture during a firefight without ever losing his rhythm. He was her spotter and her friend, and the only person on this whole planet who ever really saw her all the way through. She holds the tag for the length of one slow breath. Then she lets it fall back against her skin, and she flips the sign to open, and the world sees a diner owner in a flour-dusted apron. The world does not see the woman who lay flat on a shale ridge for 14 hours straight in a windstorm and never once let her hand shake. The envelope came on a Wednesday morning between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd. It was heavy, cream-colored, sealed with an emblem she had spent 16 years training herself not to feel anything about. She almost slid it into the pile of junk mail without opening it. When she finally slid a butter knife under the flap and unfolded the letter at the counter, her hand, the steadiest hand 3 different services had ever put on a stopwatch, trembled just once. Inside was a single page of dense official language, and it told her 3 things she had not been prepared to read on an ordinary Wednesday in a small diner in West Virginia. It told her that the mission on the corridor had at long last been formally declassified. It told her that the country she had bled for on that ridge finally knew, in specific and terrible detail, what had happened up there in the wind and the dark. And it told her that in exactly 19 days, in a ceremony at the Marine Barracks in Washington, in front of the flags and the cameras and the President of the United States, they intended to place the Medal of Honor around her neck. She sat down slowly on the stool behind the register. She read the letter 4 times. She read about the ribbon and the schedule and the seating chart, and none of it reached her. Then her eyes found the last paragraph, the one that made her set the letter flat on the counter and press her palm down hard on top of it, as if she needed to hold the words still. It said that the survivors of the corridor had all been located and would be present. It said that the names of the fallen from that operation would be read aloud, one by one, into the microphone. Preacher's name, spoken out in the light, in a room full of people who were still breathing. She did not care about the medal. She had never cared about medals. There was a shoebox in the back of her closet full of ribbons and citations and folded commendations she had never once shown to another human being, and it had been closed for so long the tape on the lid was yellow. But she cared with the whole burning core of her about that one line. She cared about Isaiah Monroe's name being spoken out loud in a place where people could hear it, instead of stamped into a classified folder in a windowless basement in Virginia. So she pulled a dress out of the back of the closet. She decided at the last minute it was not the right one. She borrowed a gold gown from her neighbor across the street who used to sing in a nightclub in Charleston, and she made up her mind. She would drive to Washington. She would say nearly nothing. She would hear his name in the light. She would come home on Sunday and open the diner Monday morning and pour coffee for the truck driver who always ordered 2 eggs over medium. She did not know yet that she would arrive at the reception 45 minutes early, take a quiet position against the wall near the bar, and be mistaken for someone who had wandered in from the wrong door. She did not know who else was on the guest list that night. She did not know that 400 miles away, at that very moment, a silver-haired Marine general was having his uniform pressed by an aide who was already terrified of him. In a career built entirely out of polished marble, Lieutenant General Harlan Whitcomb had never once been asked to prove that he belonged in a room. He was the kind of officer the Corps put on recruiting posters when the cameras needed a jawline. Silver at the temples, straight as a rifle barrel. A voice that carried whether he wanted it to or not. He had commanded a Marine Expeditionary Force in the Pacific, shaken hands with 2 sitting presidents, and this month, his name was in front of the Senate for the assistant commandant post. Everyone said the vote was a formality. Everyone said the 4th star was already at the engraver. For years at events precisely like this one, General Whitcomb had told a story. He told it beautifully. He told it about a valley in a country the papers rarely bothered to name anymore. About a force recon element pinned down in a rock wash with the sun going out on them and the birds grounded by weather. About how the enemy had those Marines dead to rights, and how somehow, out of a mountain nobody thought a human being could hold, an unseen shooter had cut the ambush apart, one impossible round at a time, until his boys crawled out of that riverbed alive at dawn. He told it because one of those Marines in the wash had been his own son, a young lieutenant named Beckett Whitcomb on his very first deployment. He told it as proof of the thing he loved most in the world, which was the growing legend of Harlan Whitcomb, father of a survivor, mentor of heroes, a man history was clearly building a monument to inch by inch. He never told the part he did not actually know. He never told them who the shooter had been. The operation had been buried so deep in the classified vault that even he, with all his stars and all his access, had only ever heard the call sign that came across the encrypted net that night. A single strange word the survivors spoke like an incantation. Halo. He would say it at the end of the story, letting the ice clink against the crystal in his glass, and the table would go quiet, and he would let the silence sit there long enough to warm his own reflection in it. In 16 years, it had never once occurred to General Whitcomb to actually go looking for the shooter. It had never once crossed his mind that the person who had saved his only son might be alive somewhere, wearing long sleeves in a diner, holding a dog tag that was not her own. The legend was more useful exactly the way it was. Faceless. Grand. A spotlight that happened to fall conveniently across his own shoulders every time he opened his mouth. So when he swept into that ballroom in Washington that evening, glowing under the chandeliers, 3 weeks from a fourth star, and his eyes landed on an unfamiliar black woman in a gold gown standing quietly by the bar, he did not see a hero. He saw an irregularity. He saw someone who was not on any arm, not in any chain of command, not in any circle he recognized. And he decided, in the casual way powerful men make 100 small, unkind decisions before breakfast, that it would be entertaining to correct the discrepancy in front of an audience. He had told the legend of Halo 100 times in rooms exactly like this one. He had never once imagined she might be standing 3 feet away from him, sipping a glass of water, while he informed her that the service entrance was around the back. 16 years before the gold dress, before the diner, before the long sleeves, there was a mountain in a country the maps only reluctantly acknowledged. The valley below it had no name that mattered to anyone outside the intelligence community. It was the kind of place countries send their most talented children into, and then classify so ruthlessly that whatever those children do there never officially happened. Marion Ellsbury was a Marine Scout sniper then, and she was already something the senior instructors at Quantico did not quite have vocabulary for. She did not shoot the way other shooters shot. She shot the way other people breathed, without deciding to, without effort. You could stand next to her on a range and watch her see the wind bend the tall grass, watch her feel the mirage lie about distance, watch her calculate the slow rotation of the earth itself somewhere below the level of conscious thought. And the round would go exactly where the math said it would go, every single time, until the men around her stopped calling it skill and started calling it something a little closer to prayer. There were instructors who volunteered to spot for her just so they could tell people years later that they had. She had a spotter named Preacher, a big freckle-faced kid from Louisiana who talked constantly about his mama's cooking and quoted the book of Isaiah when the incoming rounds got close, and who could read wind through a spotting scope the way a musician reads sheet music. He was the only person on the whole planet who was not a little afraid of her, and because of that, he was the only person in her whole life she had ever really loved. He kept a running list of every restaurant he was going to visit when they got stateside. He called her the most dangerous introvert in the Northern Hemisphere. One slow, boring afternoon in a hide overlooking nothing much at all, he had pulled out a cheap makeshift needle he had been improvising with and inked a small mark on the inside of her forearm just below the wrist, 2 crossed rifles and a thin circle above them. A halo. He grinned the entire time he did it. "Every angel needs a halo, Marion," he told her, dabbing at the fresh ink with a bandana. "And you are the patron saint of very bad men having a very bad morning." She had rolled her eyes and called him an idiot. She had also never once in 16 years thought about having it lasered off. The day everything went sideways, a force reconnaissance element got pinned down in a dry rock wash at the floor of that valley. 8 Marines boxed in on 3 sides as the sun died. One of them was a 22-year-old first lieutenant on his first real deployment named Beckett Whitcomb. Marion did not know his name and would not learn it for 16 years. What she knew, lying flat on the shale ridge above them with her rifle already zeroed and Preacher pressed shoulder to shoulder beside her, was that the weather was coming down hard. The helicopters were grounded. The radios were choking on static bouncing off the valley walls, and those 8 Marines were about to be overrun in the dark, while the rest of the world looked politely the other way. She and Preacher were the only firing angle in the entire theater. 2 people, 1 rifle, on a freezing lip of stone above a valley full of men who wanted those Marines dead before sunrise. So she went to work. There is no honest way to make what she did that night sound modest. The range was punishing. The wind came scything down the corridor in gusts that would have thrown any normal shooters round a full body's width off target. The light collapsed inside the first hour, and then the storm swallowed even the moon, and still she read the valley through her scope like a page she had personally written. Preacher called the wind in a low, steady murmur beside her ear. "Hold 1/2 mil right, now full, now hold steady, breathe." She trusted him with her own life, and with the lives of 8 strangers she had never met, and she pressed the trigger, and a man who had been about to overrun the wash simply stopped being a threat. Then another, then another. For 14 hours she held that valley closed by mathematics and refusal. Her fingers went past cold into a numbness that scared even her, and she flexed them one at a time so she would not lose the trigger discipline. Every time the enemy massed for another rush, a round came out of the impossible black and took the leader down before he had finished pointing. There was a moment near hour 10 when a return round cracked past so close to her head that grit stung the side of her cheek, and Preacher's palm landed flat against her back, steadying her, and he whispered without any tremor in his voice at all, "You are still here, Marion. Keep breathing. God is watching this, and so am I." There was one shot that outlasted all the others in the memory of the men who lived through that night. It was the shot the survivors would argue about at reunions for the rest of their lives, because none of them could ever quite make the numbers work on paper. Near midnight, a Russian-made heavy machine gun crew set up on the lip of the wash, close enough that the first burst would have ended everything for the Marines trapped below. There was no time and almost no light and a full crosswind punching down the corridor. Preacher breathed the call soft as a hymn. Marion did not so much aim as decide. The machine gun never opened up. The Marines in the rock wash heard the crack of the report roll down the mountain a full 2 seconds after the gunner slumped, and one of them, a young lieutenant named Beckett, put his forehead flat against the cold gravel and wept openly because he understood in that single instant that someone he could not see was refusing on his behalf to let him die. The Marines in the wash could not see her. They could not raise anyone at all on the encrypted net for hours at a stretch. All they had was a soft voice that broke through the static in bursts, telling them to hold, to breathe, to move on her count. They did not know if the voice belonged to a man or a woman or a ghost. Somewhere in the second hour of the engagement, someone in the Tactical Operations Center 100 miles away started calling the unseen shooter halo, because a halo is the thing you look for when the darkness is coming and you have nothing left to pray to. The name stuck to her like blood on a rock, and she did not miss, not once, not in 14 hours, not in the wind. That should have been physically impossible, not when her vision blurred from exhaustion, not when her body begged her to close her eyes for just 1 second. 8 Marines were still breathing in that wash, and every single breath was another round she had not sent wide. And then in the very last hour the mountain found her. An enemy element had climbed the backside of the ridge in the storm, hunting the ghost that had been gutting them for half a night. They found the hide. Preacher saw them a fraction of a second before she did, and in that fraction, he did the only thing he had ever really taught her about war. He put his own body between the threat and hers. He shoved her flat against the shale and rose up into the danger himself, so she would have the half second she needed to swing the rifle and turn. She ended it. She ended all 4 of them before the echo of the first burst had cleared the ridge. But when the shooting stopped and the wind screamed back into the vacuum and she reached for him in the dark, the big goofy kid from Baton Rouge was already gone. His hand still curled around his spotting scope. His blood already freezing to the rock she had defended with him. She did not fall apart. She could not afford to. Not yet. 8 Marines were still alive in that riverbed, and the night was not done with any of them. So she pulled his dog tag over his head with hands that had suddenly stopped being steady, and she looped the chain around her own neck, and she went back on the rifle alone with her cheek wet and freezing to the stock, and she finished the job. When the storm finally broke just before dawn and the birds could fly again, she came down off that ridge on foot in the gray light to help pull out the last wounded Marine, because the medevac could not land close enough to reach him, and she would not leave a job undone. He was the youngest of them, shot clean through the thigh, bleeding out slowly, half awake and half already somewhere else. She knelt over him and tied off the femoral bleed with hands that had finally, after 14 hours, remembered how to shake. That kid looked up at the person saving his life. He was too far into the shock to hold her face in memory, but he saw the forearm working the tourniquet close and clear in the gray dawn. And on that forearm, inked into the skin just below the wrist, he saw a small, thin halo floating serenely above two crossed rifles. Then medics were pulling him onto the bird, and when he looked back for her, she was already gone. Back up the scree, into the rocks to carry Preacher's body down herself, a shape dissolving into the mist. That kid was First Lieutenant Beckett Whitcomb, and for 16 years afterward, in every quiet moment his father would let him have, he described the exact same two things to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it. A voice on the net telling him to breathe, and a halo tattooed on a woman's wrist. The mission was buried. The corridor was scrubbed from every record a civilian could ever hope to file for. Marion Ellsbury came home with a folded flag that was not for a husband and a dog tag that was not her own, and she disappeared into a diner in the mountains and a life full of long sleeves. The survivors of the wash scattered across the fleet and across the years, and they did the only thing men in their position could still do for a hero they were forbidden from nomming. They pooled their money quietly, and they had a single small brass coin struck by a private mint in Virginia. On one face, the outline of a mountain ridge. On the other, a single word: Halo. Beckett Whitcomb carried that coin in his front trouser pocket every single day for 16 years, turning it over with his thumb until the raised edges of the ridge went smooth as glass, waiting for a chance he had slowly, quietly stopped believing would ever actually come. Neither of them knew that the chance was less than 3 weeks away, in a marble ballroom lit by chandeliers, and that it would begin with his own father throwing a mocking salute at the patron saint of the corridor, and asking her with a wide practiced grin what rank she thought she could possibly have held. Marion arrived at the reception early on purpose. Crowds were something she managed rather than enjoyed, and she wanted to be settled in before the room filled up around her. She tucked herself against the wall near the bar with her back to the paneling, and a clear line of sight to every door in the ballroom. She held a glass of ice water she did not intend to drink, and she counted the exits without meaning to, the way she counted them everywhere she went now, in grocery stores and gas stations and small country churches back home. She was not here to be seen. She was here to hear one name read aloud in a room full of the living, and then she was going home to open her diner on Monday morning. She looked quietly stunning that night. The borrowed gold gown fit her as if it had been hanging patiently in her neighbor's closet all these years, just waiting for her to reach for it. But she carried herself the way she carried absolutely everything in her life. Without a single wasted motion, without a single glance that lingered too long, without a single gesture that called for attention. Officers drifted past her on their way to the bar and registered only a calm, striking woman standing alone against the paneling, and their eyes slid onward. She had spent her entire adult life being looked at and not seen, and she had made a peace with it a long time ago. Being invisible had kept her alive on more than one continent. Lieutenant General Harlan Whitcomb did not do peace. He did entrance. He swept into the ballroom with his wife Margaret on his arm and a wake of deferential aides behind him, and his eyes moved across the room the same way a foreman's eyes move across a job site he already owns. When his gaze landed on Marion, something inside him decided immediately that she was a discrepancy. A woman he did not recognize, not on any arm, not in any known chain of command. Standing in his ballroom as if she had any right whatsoever to the floor tiles under her heels. To a man like Whitcomb, that was not a person. That was a small problem waiting to be corrected in front of an audience for sport. "You must have gotten turned around, darling," he said, and the word landed exactly the way he wanted it to. Soft, familiar, filthy with condescension. Marion turned her head slowly. She had heard that tone from 10,000 different mouths in her lifetime. From drill instructors who assumed she would quit within a week, from enemies who assumed she would miss. She gave him back a small, polite smile, the smile of a woman who was still, for the moment, choosing to be gracious. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be," she said quietly. He stepped fully in front of her, cutting her off from the rest of the room, and the game began in earnest. "The staff entrance is around the back, sweetheart. Someone from catering should have told you that when you signed in." He let his eyes track down the gold gown, and then flicked one manicured finger toward the bare curve of her shoulder, at the place where a uniform blouse would have carried the weight of a career, as if to point out how empty it was. Around him, a small crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of a general finding sport. A few officers chuckled because he was a 3-star and laughing along was easy and safe and cost them nothing. Margaret floated up in cream silk and joined the hunt with the casual confidence of a woman who had never once in her life been the target of it. "Harlan, be nice," she purred, meaning none of it. "She's clearly confused." She said it to the little crowd, not to Marion. The way you might talk about a lost dog in a nice restaurant. A young captain near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight uncomfortably and half opened his mouth as if to say something. Whitcomb caught the motion and waved him down without even turning his head, the way you wave off a waiter who has arrived at the wrong moment. And the young captain closed his mouth and looked down at his polished shoes. That single small surrender settled over the whole crowd like a lid. Nobody was going to intervene. Not tonight. Not on him. Margaret leaned toward one of her friends and said, loud enough to carry 3 tables, that she simply could not understand how they were letting just anyone into these functions anymore. Her friend laughed behind a jeweled hand, and 2 more phones tilted up to catch the general being witty for posterity. To everyone in the room watching, it looked exactly like what the powerful always want cruelty to look like. Harmless, amusing, somehow earned. Here is the thing the entire laughing room did not understand. Marion Ellsbury could have ended it with a single sentence. She could have said 2 quiet words and watched the color drain out of the general's handsome tanned face right there in front of every camera. She had ended men considerably more dangerous than him with considerably less. But she was tired in a way none of them could imagine. Tired down at the level of bone marrow. And she had not driven 9 hours through the mountains to win a fight with a peacock. She had come to hear Isaiah Monroe's name spoken out loud. So she held still. She let him talk. And she paid the toll the way women like her have always been made to pay it, with silence and a straight spine and something behind her ribs that stayed absolutely quiet. Somewhere behind her sternum the ridge stirred, the cold wind and the shale and preacher's palm flat against her back, and she breathed it down carefully the way she had trained herself to over 16 quiet years. She stayed silent. "Marine Scout snipers," she said finally, when he demanded again what unit she could possibly have belonged to. "A long time ago." It was the truest, most understated sentence any human being said inside that building all night. He laughed out loud. Really laughed. "You, a sniper." He said it not to her but to the room, and the room gave him back exactly the laugh he was hunting for. A phone came up at the edge of the crowd. Then another one. Filming the fun, because a laughing 3-star general is content, and content is currency in the year of our Lord we are living in. Emboldened, Whitcomb reached for the grand theatrical gesture, the thing that would make the story worth retelling at breakfast tomorrow. He lifted his crystal tumbler high above his head. "A toast," he announced to the whole ballroom, "to the Lady General in the gold dress." Then he snapped his heels together with parade ground precision and threw her a crisp mocking salute, holding it there, milking every second of it while the officers around him grinned openly and the phones drank in the footage. "Well then, tell us, ma'am, what was your rank?" Not everyone in that room was laughing. Along the far wall, a gray-haired sergeant major in dress blues had gone perfectly still, his eyes moving slowly from the halo of laughter to the quiet woman standing at its center. A small hard frown gathering across his mouth. Near the double doors that led to the anteroom, a Navy captain with combat ribbons stacked 4 deep had folded his arms tight across his chest and set his jaw like a stone. They did not yet know who she was. They only knew the way old warriors always know, that something about the quiet woman by the bar did not match up with the joke the general was busy telling about her, and that men who mistake stillness for weakness are usually the very last ones to find out how badly they were wrong. The gray-haired sergeant major took one small step off the wall and then caught himself, because he outranked no one here, and a scene would only make things worse for the woman being humiliated. He would tell his wife later that he had never in 32 years of service wanted so badly to be wrong about what he was watching unfold. He looked at Marion setting down her ice water carefully on the bar, and he thought, that is not the stillness of a woman who is afraid. That is the stillness of someone quietly deciding whether or not to be merciful. And inside that stillness, Marion was running the arithmetic she had been running her whole life. How much does it cost me to let this go? How much does it cost me to end it right here? She had learned on a mountain 16 years ago that the loudest possible answer is almost always silence, and that men who most deserve to be humbled will almost always do the entire job themselves if you only give them enough rope and enough time. So she gave him rope. She waited. She let him climb. Whitcomb leaned in close now, grinning ear to ear, going for the finish. "Come on, sweetheart," he said. "What rank?" Marion set her water glass down on the bar without a sound. She looked at him. This shining silver-haired man who had never once in his life been cold or afraid or alone at altitude. This man playing a hero in a room absolutely full of medals. And for one single moment, 16 years of swallowed grief moved behind her eyes and then went perfectly still again. "Higher than yours," she said. She said it quietly. She did not say it as a boast. She said it the exact way you would state a fact that happens to be true. The way you would say the sky is up or the water is cold. And because the room could not conceive of a universe in which it was actually true, the room laughed harder than it had laughed all night. Margaret actually clapped, her rings flashing under the chandeliers, delighted. The general wiped a genuine tear of laughter from the corner of his eye and shook his head at the sheer unbelievable nerve of this nobody in a gold dress, and he reached out one hand to pat her on the cheek. The final insult. The little indulgent tap you give a small child who has said something adorable and stupid at the dinner table. His fingers brushed past her cheek and grazed the bare skin of her wrist. The gold sleeve, loose at the cuff, slid back 2 full inches. 2 inches of forearm skin. A thin ring floating serenely above 2 crossed rifles. The exact mark a bleeding lieutenant had memorized on the worst night of his entire life 16 years ago, and described in painstaking detail to anyone who would listen for every year since. And General Harlan Whitcomb, who had told the legend of Halo 100 different times in 100 different rooms without ever once bothering to look for her face, finally looked down and saw the mark inked on the wrist of the woman he had just called catering. The laugh died in his throat like a candle pinched between 2 wet fingers. For a long moment his face did absolutely nothing at all, because his mind was actively refusing the information his eyes were sending it. He knew that mark. He had never once seen it with his own eyes, but he knew it better than his own reflection, because his only son had sketched it on cocktail napkins in 100 different restaurants, had described it during 100 late-night phone calls home, had tattooed it into the private mythology of the Whitcomb family until it was as familiar to Harlan as the eagle globe and anchor. A halo, above 2 crossed rifles. The mark on the wrist of the ghost who had come down off the mountain and saved his boy in the rock wash. The mark of Halo. His hand was still hovering in the air by her cheek. He pulled it back very slowly, as if the woman standing in front of him were made of open flame, and his mouth opened and produced absolutely no sound at all. Across the crowded ballroom, Major Beckett Whitcomb had been half listening to his father hold court, the way he had trained himself to half listen years ago at events like this one. Then he saw the old man's tanned face go a strange color, and he followed his father's frozen stare down to a woman's exposed forearm. And Beckett Whitcomb, decorated Marine officer, veteran of the worst rock piles this century has produced, stopped being a major in that instant and became again in a single heartbeat a 22-year-old lieutenant bleeding out in a dry wash, while a calm voice on a broken radio told him to keep breathing. He crossed the ballroom without any conscious memory of the decision to move. People stepped out of his path the way water parts around a stone. He stopped in front of her, and his eyes went from the halo on her wrist to her face and back down to the halo again, and his mouth worked several times before any sound at all came out of it. "Halo," he finally whispered. It came out cracked and small in the voice of a much younger man. My God, it's you. It's really you." Every single glass in that immediate vicinity stopped moving. Marion looked at the tall, broad-shouldered officer standing in front of her. She looked at the tears already spilling down his cheeks. She looked at the pure ruined disbelief on his face, and something inside her chest that she had kept clamped down tight and airless for 16 straight years shifted just half an inch open. She had never known his name. She had never known any of their names, but she knew that leg. She had knelt over that thigh in the freezing gray dawn and tied off the bleed with her own 2 hands, and she had spent 16 quiet years not knowing whether the young Marine on the other end of that tourniquet had lived long enough to make it home or died somewhere on the flight out. Now here he stood in front of her, alive, wearing the oak leaves of a major, wearing the badge of a combat veteran. Alive. "You made it home," she said quietly. It was not a question. It was 16 years of a wound she had never once allowed herself to name out loud finally closing over at long last. Beckett's hand was already shaking as it went to the front pocket of his dress trousers. He drew out a small brass coin, the edges worn smooth by 16 years of a thumb that could never stop turning it over and over. He took her hand, the one with the halo, and he pressed the coin down flat into her open palm and closed her fingers around it, and he could barely force the words up past his throat. "We had these made," he whispered. "All of us, all 8 of us. We never knew your name, we never knew your face. We only knew you were real, and we swore to each other, all 8 of us, that we would never stop looking for you as long as we were still breathing." His voice broke completely apart. "Ma'am, I have carried this coin every single day for 16 years, praying to God I would live long enough to put it into your hand. I have a wife. I have 2 little girls. They exist, ma'am. They exist because of you. Everything I have in this entire world exists because of you." That was the moment the ballroom finally understood that something enormous was happening in the middle of it, even though most of the 400 witnesses in that room still had no idea what. Up on the low stage at the front of the ballroom, a 4-star Marine general who had been standing quietly by the podium set down his own glass of bourbon and stepped up to the microphone. He was the presiding officer of the entire ceremony that night, and he had known exactly who the woman in the gold gown was from the second she had walked through the front doors. He had watched the entire performance from across the room with a face like a slowly closing vault. He tapped the microphone once. The whole ballroom turned as if pulled by a single wire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled every marble corner of the hall. "We are here tonight for one reason: to finally publicly honor an American Marine whose actions on foreign soil were held under seal for 16 years. He looked directly at Marion. "Tonight, on behalf of a grateful nation, the President has awarded the Medal of Honor to a Marine Scout sniper who held a ridge alone through a windstorm for 14 hours and brought 8 trapped force reconnaissance Marines home alive. For 16 years, the men she saved knew her only by a single word." He paused deliberately and let the pause do its own work. "Tonight, we can finally speak her name. Gunnery Sergeant Marion Ellsbury, United States Marine Corps, retired. Some of you know her better as Halo." The sound that moved through the room was not applause. It was something older and lower than applause. It was 400 professional warriors inhaling at the exact same instant, and then one by one, without any conscious coordination between them, beginning to rise from their chairs. The general kept reading. He read the full citation. He read the range and the wind speed and the 14 hours. And grown officers who had personally seen combat on 3 continents shook their heads slowly at the numbers, because they understood better than any civilian ever possibly could that what he was reading aloud was not supposed to be physically possible. He read the line about how, after 14 hours on the rifle, the shooter had come down off the ridge on foot into the open corridor to personally carry out the last wounded Marine, because the medevac could not reach him in time. Half the room turned instinctively to look at Beckett Whitcomb without meaning to, because half the room had heard him tell that story at one function or another across 16 years, the story of the steady hands and the halo, and they had always politely assumed it was the beautiful embellishment of a young man who had survived something no young man was supposed to survive. They understood now, all at once, that he had never exaggerated a single syllable of it. Then he read the part Marion had driven 9 hours through the mountains to hear. He read the names of the fallen. And when he reached one specific name, when he said the words Corporal Isaiah Monroe, spotter, who gave his life shielding his shooter so that she could continue the fight and complete the mission, Marion Ellsbury, the woman who had not missed a single round in 14 hours on a windswept ridge, who had buried her grief in a small mountain diner for 16 years, finally closed her eyes and let 2 slow tears fall down her face. Preacher's name, spoken out loud, in the light. In a room full of people who were still breathing. That was every single thing she had come 9 hours through the mountains for. Everything else in that ballroom was noise. Then the presiding general did the thing that transformed Harlan Whitcomb's private disaster into a fully public one. For those who may have forgotten the tradition, he said, letting his gaze drift once, deliberately, to the frozen 3-star still standing beside the bar. The Medal of Honor is the one single distinction in this country that reverses the salute. Every member of the armed services, regardless of grade, up to and including the most senior flag officer in this ballroom, renders the first salute to its recipient. Rank does not outrank the medal. Nothing does, higher than yours. She had told him the truth. She had told him the plainest, most literal, most unadorned truth in the entire building, and he had laughed directly into her face and reached out to pat her cheek like she was a child at a dinner party. Now the entire room knew it. Now the entire room turned as one to look at the silver-haired general with the 4th star already at the engraver. The man who had told the legend of Halo at a dozen dinner parties to make himself glow, and who had just spent 5 uninterrupted minutes mocking her in front of 400 witnesses and 24 raised phones. Beckett was the first to render the salute. He stepped back 1 full pace, drew himself up to full rigid attention in front of the woman who had saved his life 16 years ago, and brought his hand up in the slowest, most reverent salute of his entire career. Tears still running openly down his face and dropping off his jaw onto the marble floor. Then the gray-haired sergeant major by the wall saluted. Then the Navy captain by the doors. Then, like a tide coming in, the entire ballroom came to attention for the quiet woman in the gold gown. A young ensign near the stage was crying without shame. The bartender, a retired chief who had poured drinks at receptions like this one for 22 years, set down his towel and came to attention behind the bar. Even the camera crew hired to film the evening slowly lowered their equipment and stood at attention with the rest. In the middle of all that motion, Marion stood perfectly still, the brass coin pressed so tightly into her closed palm that its edges left a small ridge line printed into her own skin, a mark she would find hours later back in her hotel room and not remember making. In the middle of that rising tide of respect stood one man who had not moved and could not move, whose hand would not obey him, whose handsome tanned face had gone the exact color of wet ash. General Harlan Whitcomb finally understood that the joke he had told to the entire room was about to become the story the entire country told about him, and that the only way out was to lift his hand and salute the woman he had just humiliated in front of every camera in the building, or refuse and end his career where he stood. His hand finally came up. He had no choice left, and everyone in the room watching knew he had no choice left, which stripped the gesture of the last shred of dignity he might have salvaged from it. He saluted her. The man who had thrown a mocking salute at her 90 seconds earlier now held a real one, stiff and visibly trembling, his eyes wet with something that was not exactly sorrow. Marion returned the salute, crisp, correct, unhurried. She gave him back the exact courtesy he had refused her, and in giving it back to him, she made the difference between the two of them a thing that no one in that ballroom would ever be able to unsee. Beside him, Margaret had already begun to leave him, though she had not yet moved a single physical step. She unhooked her hand from his arm and took one small, deliberate step sideways, opening a gap of cold air between herself and the man she had married for exactly the future that was now dissolving in front of every phone in the room. Then Marion spoke, and she spoke gently, which was somehow far worse for him than shouting. "You did not need to know who I was, General," she said. "That is the whole point. You should have been kind to catering." It was not a taunt. It was not a line built to draw blood. It was a quiet correction from a woman who had earned the right to correct him 10,000 times over, and it landed in that ballroom like a verdict read from a bench. In the weeks that followed, the story went where such stories go now, everywhere all at once. Harlan Whitcomb's name was quietly withdrawn from the confirmation. There was a review. There was a statement thick with the word regret. The fourth star was never engraved. Margaret was gone by spring. Marion did not celebrate any of it. That was never what she had come for. What she did instead was drive to a small brick house in Baton Rouge where a gray-haired mother still kept a bedroom exactly the way her son had left it 16 years before. And she sat at that woman's kitchen table for a long, slow afternoon and told her in complete detail, for the very first time, exactly what Isaiah had done on the ridge. She started a fund with his name on it. The Monroe Foundation, for the families of Marines who serve in the quiet places and come home to nothing, or do not come home at all. Beckett Whitcomb runs it alongside her now. He still calls her ma'am. She still tells him to stop. He never will. If this story moved you tonight, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe and stay a while, because we tell the stories of the overlooked and the underestimated here. And share this one with somebody who needs the reminder tonight that the quiet person you almost walked right past may be the exact one holding the line you are standing safely behind. Peace.